Let me just first say that the views I present here are not really Commission's views. These are my own views, my own experience. In fact, I was asked to give a little bit of, or share a little bit of my experience with you about facets of co-decision as well as comitology in the context of the latest trilogue negotiations on the economic governance package. Okay, so I'll first say a couple of words on co-decision and then I'll turn to the issue of comitology. So first let me sketch the context. As you might remember, last year a task force chaired by Herman Van Rompuy, the President of the European Council, was set up to work on reforms of economic governance. Following this task force, even actually before the end, but the Commission presented a legislative package of 6 proposals at the same time, so in terms of complexity it is definitely something that is to be considered. In September last year, with 4 proposals to strengthen fiscal coordination, and also 2 entirely new regulations on surveillance of macroeconomic imbalances. Just to point out, this is not, even though it is being put forward in the context of the crisis, the purpose was not crisis management, but is more medium and longer term. So between November last year and September this year, the trilogue negotiations took place on this package. Maybe just first to say that it was interesting to follow because it is actually a new area for the European Parliament. I mean, Parliament had not been involved, did not have co-decision powers in the area of economic governance. And the Lisbon Treaty provided through Article 121.6 this power to the European Parliament. And the negotiations on economic governance, this so-called 6-6 Act, gave an opportunity for the European Parliament to exploit these new powers, of course. First of all, it was a packaged approach. 4 of the 6 proposals were actually subject to co-decision, but also the directive and the Council regulations, on which actually, formally speaking, the Parliament would have no say, were included in the package and therefore were part of the negotiations on which the Parliament had an important input. So, of course, in the context of these discussions, the Parliament wanted to have a greater say on economic governance issues. The results, I mean, to brush to a very broad brush of this was one of the key outcomes is an economic dialogue that allows the Parliament to discuss with the other institutions on economic governance, still respecting the basic interinstitutional division of labour, whereby, of course, execution of economic surveillance remains the responsibility for Parliament, for Council and the Commission, but an increased role now for the Parliament to check the applications of this new legislation and also to discuss the results of surveillance, so that the Parliament has a greater say and can better control economic surveillance executed by Council and Commission. Maybe an interesting note is that Parliament was not just asking for an increase in its own powers, but also actually strengthened a lot, wanted to strengthen the role of the European Commission. In particular, I think in this regard it's interesting to point out the amount of the Parliament which actually was taken up on several occasions to use more what is called reverse qualified majority voting. And just to briefly, for those not familiar, explain, is just instead of deciding on qualified majority as is normally the case, a proposal of the Commission is automatically adopted by the Council unless the Council goes against it with a qualified majority. So, you know, you need a qualified majority to block instead of to agree. This, against the background of the crisis, this was considered to be a very high priority on the side of the European Commission. So the President Barroso from the very beginning asked for a very speedy adoption process to reach agreement in the first reading. And it was a very ambitious schedule they had imposed themselves because they wanted it to be speedier even than the so-called financial supervision package that only lasted, the negotiation lasted only 12 months. So it was a very high ambition they had from the very beginning. The Hungarian presidency made it the absolute priority of their presidency as well. And in the European Parliament, even though I think generally there was a broad agreement, some political parties were not convinced that this legislation had to be rushed through the European Parliament, which actually gave also, I think, in these negotiations, the Parliament some extra leverage, because, you know, some of the parliamentarians were not convinced that it needed to be to go so quickly, so were less inclined to accommodate the views of the Council. So in the end, the co-decision procedure was finalized in around 10-11 months. So taking into account some of the elements Professor Retier just pointed out in terms of complexity, this was absolutely very complex. It was these negotiations of 6 files at the same time, so these were big trilogue negotiations with 6 MEPs, very often at the same, mostly actually informal dialogues together in the room. So it was very complex, and the workload was of course very heavy, given the coordination and the relation between some of the proposals and so on. It was a quite challenging task. So it was very fast, I think also, but I think Professor Retier could say more on this. In the period 2004-2009, I mean, on average, early agreements are 15 months for co-decision files, and this is, of course, you see, 10-11 months is very, very fast. Then maybe, secondly, to say something on what has been discussed less now so far, but I understand that also my colleague will go more into depth, is the issue of comitology and the use of Article 290 and Article 291. There, I think there was also an interesting experience in the context of these negotiations, namely a big discussion took place between Parliament and Council in the regulation on macroeconomic imbalances. So this is the part of the package which was entirely new. And the basic issue was that in the context of this legislation, a so-called scoreboard to monitor imbalances needed to be established. And in the Commission's proposal, the idea was to have it outside of the legislation, because the legislation was supposed to be procedural on the process and not on the content, and wanted to keep these indicators also outside of the process. But a fair argument was made by Council and Parliament that this scoreboard is in a way also describes the scope of the surveillance of these imbalances. What are imbalances are somewhat indirectly defined through the scoreboard, and therefore they wanted to have a say on how this scoreboard would be established. In this context then, a discussion arose of how this scoreboard should be adopted, what kind of procedure should be followed. And the Parliament would favor to use this so-called delegated act based on Article 290, and the Council chose rather for implementing act. I will not go too much in the different elements of these articles, because I understand that we will go more into depth in the next presentation on this. But basically, you have very opposing views on this. The basic difference is that, of course, in Article 290, the Parliament has the equal right with the Council on this delegated act, whereas in the context of implementing acts, the power of the Parliament is much more limited. So we see these opposing views, and you could also see translated into discussions between the legal services of the institutions, which actually, and that was I think quite interestingly, found always interesting and solid argumentation to support the preference of their institutions. And actually it seemed to me, in my personal experience, that depending on how you would frame the issue, how you would put it in the legislation, you could actually either choose for one article or the other. So maybe just to conclude on this element, not being a legal expert, it looks like the legal situation allows actually this scope, you know, of institutional discussion to take place. Then, what was the compromise? And I think this is the interesting part. So it was one of the sticky points in negotiations, which lasted until one of the very last trilogue negotiations. And actually the Parliament dropped its request for a delegated act, as well as the Council did also drop its request on the implementing act based on Article 121. And they chose for a kind of alternative process, an alternative informal adoption process. And since this is informal, it had to be informal and it couldn't be legally binding, the decision was made that it could not be put into the regulation, but it had to be put in the recitals, which are not legally binding. And it said that in the end, the responsibility for the scoreboard would, as the Commission has proposed, be with the European Commission, but Parliament and Council would be consulted in an informal way, on equal footing, but in an informal way. So maybe just I'm about to finish, but just to say that it's a kind of ad hoc alternative procedure, and at the moment this is, even though legislation is not fully into force, I mean, we try already to work along the lines of the legislation to start to implement it in order to be in time when it formally enters into force. So this process is ongoing, the process of trying to implement this recital, and it turns out that this is already a challenge for both institutions, because since there are no clear established procedures as to how informally consult, this creates some let's put it a bit of a difficult situation. The Commission has now proposed, or what the Commission has done is it has sent a letter, the Commissioner has sent a letter to the European Parliament and the Council explaining the procedure and adding the scoreboard suggestions of the Commission. And now Parliament and Council have to react. Of course, in the Parliament, to me it's not clear how they're exactly going to deal with it. During the trilogue discussions, this was one of the issues that was unclear, because Parliament has no established procedure of how to deal with this. And in the context of the discussions of the Council, it also seemed already somewhat difficult, because now the Council yesterday actually pronounced itself on the scoreboard, gave its views on the scoreboard, whereas it's rather unusual that the Council does something like that, since this is not even a final Commission proposal. It's just input we request from the Council, and it's rather unusual that this happens rather than waiting until the Commission makes its final proposal. So just to wrap up, the result of these discussions was between Council and Parliament on the adoption of the scoreboard was an informal process with the aim of avoiding to use Article 290, 291. So I think it's an interesting example of how this kind of alternative solution has been found. Maybe just one footnote to stimulate the reflection, because there was a big discussion on the use of the delegated act on this adoption of the scoreboard. But when you look at the package, and this was not the regulation that I followed most closely, but if you look at other parts of the package, namely the regulation on effective enforcement and budgetary surveillance, there is also a delegated act foreseen in the legislation. Namely a delegated act to further detail the procedural rules of how sanction mechanism in case of statistical fraud would work. And there was very little discussion between Council and Parliament on the use of a delegated act. So it is interesting to reflect on how in one case, there can be huge discussions depending, I guess, also on how crucial issues, although it's difficult to say that in the case of the statistical fines it's not an important issue. I think I can leave it at that. Thank you.